Ready to go? Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rosa Maria Vargas-Martes. Rosa is originally from the town of Ayuya, from Puerto Rico. She has been interested in meteorology from a very young age, and pursuing these interests, she decided to start a bachelor's degree in physics at the University of Puerto Rico with a minor in meteorology there. Fortunately, after the passing of Hurricane Maria in 2017, Rosa decided to move to SUNY Albany, where she finished her degree in 2018. And after that, she moved to the University of Michigan and began her graduate education with me, and then since 2020 moved here with me as part of the great AOS pushing event, where the whole research group got relocated to be here. And she will today be presenting the work that she's been doing since we started out in Michigan, which is part of her NSF GRNP fellowship, and we are hoping to, we are writing these results for publication. So without any further ado, Rosa, take it away.
Hello everyone, as Angel mentioned, my name is Rosa Maria Vargas-Martes. I am a fourth year PhD student working in the large-scale dynamics and general circulation group under the advisement of Professor Angel. And as he also mentioned, we are, today I will be talking a little bit about my research that we're actually preparing for publication, and it's on the role of water vapor and temperature and the thermodynamics of East Pacific and African easterly waves. So with no further ado, what are easterly waves? And to answer this question, I will first discuss easterly waves over Africa, and I will then discuss easterly waves over the East Pacific Ocean. So what are easterly waves over Africa, or African easterly waves? African easterly waves originate from the African easterly jet. They are waves who are coupled to convection. It's very important, and meaning that they organize convection. So you can actually see them as these alternating regions of high and low pressure, or enhanced and suppressed convection. They're this wave train. They are rotational disturbances, and they propagate westward over time. And as you can see from the schematic from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, something that is very important about these systems is that they often continue to become seeds for tropical cyclones in the Atlantic region. Now, what are easterly waves over the East Pacific Ocean, or Pacific easterly waves? This is a little more complicated, and a little of this stems in the fact that there are different views, different perspectives on how these systems originate, right? One of the first perspectives is that they are easterly waves that originated from over West Africa. They travel across the Atlantic and resurface in the East Pacific. And actually, if you look at tropical weather outlooks from the National Hurricane Center, and you look at their reports for the hurricanes that develop over this region, a lot of the times, because again, a lot of the hurricanes that develop over this region initiate from African easterly waves, many of them, you'll see that a lot of the times they explain that it's a wave that originated over Africa and traveled and made its way to the East Pacific. However, some other studies argue that these systems originate in situ via locally generated disturbances, or mesoscale convective systems. And they actually argue that they start somewhere close to the Panama Bight, and they later propagate westward. And some more recent studies suggest that it's actually a combination of both, that some are initially, that some are originated in situ, and some others actually have that disturbance traveling from West Africa. So as you can already imagine, this is a little more of a complicated picture. But why do we care? Why do we care about easterly waves? As I mentioned before, over both of the regions, easterly waves a lot of the time serve as seeds for tropical cyclones in both of the domains. And I think that it's cool if you look at these two tropical outlooks for the Pacific and the tropical Atlantic. I want you to pay close attention to what is here, depression 13, and depression, the disturbance with the disturbance located here. This is for September 12, 2019. This is actually during the OTREC campaign, and one of the easterly waves that was reported there. And this is actually for September 14, 2017. And both of these systems would later become what was Hurricane Pico over the Pacific and Hurricane Maria over the Atlantic. So these systems are very important just because, a lot of them serve as seeds for tropical cyclone activity, but on their own, easterly waves also represent a big source of precipitation for regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and the islands of the Caribbean. So we care about them a lot. And as I mentioned before, they're coupled to convection. In order to better understand these systems, it is imperative that we talk about the main balance in the tropics. The main balance in the tropics, when we think about or when we compare this to mid-latitudes, we think, quasi-geostrophic theory or geostrophic balance. When we think about the tropics, we have to change our perspective to what is weak temperature gradient balance. So in the tropics, the balance actually is in the thermodynamic equation. And as you can see here, this basically explains that the vertical advection of dry static energy in the atmosphere is primarily driven by diabatic heating. And a good example is how this process occurs in deep convection. And I think that this is a cool animatic. Angel actually showed it a couple of months back for his talk, and I thought that it was quite interesting. This is actually not a deep convective plume. This is actually the eruption of the Tonga volcano, and the waves that you can kind of see propagating outwards from it are actually sound waves, but I think it's a really cool analogy of what is happening in this weak temperature gradient balance. So with weak temperature gradient, for example, if you have this deep convective plume kind of occurring due to the release of latent energy, this forces gravity waves to travel outward, and these gravity waves kind of distribute temperature in the tropics, and they in the lower free troposphere, and that's why in this region you can see that they have a very weak horizontal temperature gradient. So because this is the predominant balance, and convection plays a big role in this, and we already know that easterly waves are convectively coupled, we know that properly understanding convection and how it's associated to these systems is really important as well. So for this, we now talk about our different perspectives on how convection develops in this region. And the first thing that we'll go to is the moist perspective on how convection develops. This is not as well understood, and one of the main reasons is due to the ill constrainment of entrainment, or the representation of moisture and entrainment in the convective parameterization of global circulation models. But how does it work? So essentially, let's imagine an atmosphere, right? You have this lifting mechanism, convection. If your atmosphere here isn't sufficiently moist, then mixing will act to entrainment will act to kind of mix this parcel with its surrounding atmosphere. After a time dt, this layer here kind of already has the sufficient moisture, we imagine, and the parcel is allowed to rise higher. Again, if the atmosphere isn't moist enough, then the entrainment will act to mix the parcel with its surrounding environment, again supplying moisture to the environment. But after a time 2dt, if the atmosphere is already saturated or has enough moisture, then we will be able to observe this deep convection kind of occurring. This actually takes, this is a process that takes a little longer to occur when we compare it to our parcel view. This perspective is a little better understood, and I think that it's one of the main processes where our mind goes to when we think about convection developing. And while moisture here is also present, the buoyancy is actually the factor that plays a more predominant role. And we also go and think about our buoyancy definition, or how we think of buoyancy from classes defined with our regular temperature. And if there's a lifting mechanism, for example, convection, and our particle reaches the level of free convection, and it becomes more buoyant than the surrounding atmosphere, then it's allowed to rise freely until it reaches the equilibrium level, and the parcel, again, at that level, detrains into the environment. And this is a process that is quicker than the one I explained before. And I know that I've explained how convection is important, especially in relation to these systems. But why am I explaining these two perspectives, and how do they impact or influence different kinds of waves in the tropics? And I think I had also showed this animatic for his talk. I think that it's actually kind of cool. But when we look at the tropics, there's actually a menagerie of waves, different waves occurring. Some propagate to the east, some propagate to the west, and how moisture comes into play. For example, waves that are coupled to convection, and whose convection is predominantly driven by moisture, will exhibit slower propagation speeds, okay? And waves whose convection is predominantly modulated by buoyancy or temperature will exhibit faster propagation speeds. And as you can see here, for example, you can see the MJO, who is driven by moisture. You can see how it propagates a lot slower than a lot of different waves in the tropics. So I think it's important that we kind of think about these two perspectives and how they come into play in different phenomena. So our problem, the mechanism for the development and maintenance of these two waves is not well understood. And as I mentioned before, this is predominantly caused because of the poor representation of entrainment in global circulation models. Furthermore, the origin of Pacific easterly waves has not been as thoroughly studied, and there's still no clear consensus on the initiation mechanisms for these waves over this region. So the main objective of today's talk, or my research, is to carry out a thorough comparison between these two systems. And hopefully through that examination, we wish to answer these next questions, or these overarching questions. One, does water vapor play a role in the organization of convection of easterly waves? Does temperature play a role in the organization of convection of these systems? The third question, are easterly waves different over Africa and the Pacific? And if they are, how exactly do they differ from one another? So for this study, the data that we employed, or that we use, is from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting Year 5 reanalysis over the period of 1979 to 2018, and for the regions of the East Atlantic Ocean in Africa and the East Pacific Ocean. For the variables that we analyze, we look at the winds, precipitation, geopotential, average buoyancy of the lower troposphere, specific humidity, temperature, sensible heating, outgoing long-wave radiation, incoming short-wave radiation, surface long-wave radiation, and surface short-wave radiation. As part of the methodology description, one of the main frameworks that we implemented to kind of examine the relevant role of temperature and humidity in these systems was introduced by Ahmed and Neely in 2018. And just to give you a heads up, all of these studies are fairly theoretical. So to not include as many equations, I've just included the most important one, but I will kind of verbally explain what they were. So Ahmed and Neely in 2018 developed this novel framework in which they define buoyancy rather than how I explained before with regular temperature. They explain buoyancy, or define buoyancy, in terms of equivalent potential temperature. And as we know from our classes, this is really good for the region that we're interested in, because it gives us information not only about temperature, but about humidity. After their paper in 2018, Adames et al. In 2020 and Ahmed et al. In 2021 further developed this framework and came up with this very interesting expression for estimated precipitation, which we can get just by looking at humidity contribution, temperature contribution, and enthalpy contribution. I will explain that the terms here, for example, the subscripts that are denoted with a B are for the boundary layer. The subscripts with an L are for the lower free troposphere. And here the tau terms represent the sensitivity of buoyancy to variations of enthalpy, humidity, and temperature. Here, LV is the latent heat of vaporization. dP is the thickness of our atmospheric layer. G is gravity, and Cp is the specific heat of air. But in simple terms, why do we care about this equation? This equation can separate the contribution from enthalpy, which we examined and does not contribute as much to the full term. But you can also get the individual contribution from humidity to the precipitation. And you can actually also get the contribution of temperature to precipitation. And you can examine their contributions separately, which is very interesting. So for my statistical techniques that I employed, we removed the seasonal mean. We applied a Langsos filter with a 2 to 6 day bandpass to retain variability associated to easterly waves, which is easterly waves have a period of about 3 to 5 days. And we look at the July, August, September season, as this has high easterly wave activity. We apply an empirical orthogonal function and principal component analysis on the OLR field. This is something that has been widely employed for wave studies. We carry out a linear regression analysis where we regress our fields of interest onto the first two principal components of the EOF. And so the fields that are regressed to these EOFs will now represent our easterly wave-like fields, or how these fields are related to our patterns. And to examine the statistical significance, we applied a two-sample t-test to retain the data that was significant in the 95% confidence interval. With no further ado, we get to our results. So by applying the EOF analysis over both regions, so this is a eigenvalue spectrum. Here we have the indices, and here we have the eigenvalues of the OLR. And what we can see for the Pacific and Africa, the two leading pairs seem to be well separated from the rest and seem to represent an orthogonal pair, meaning that they can explain they're related to each other. So one could be the evolution of the first, for example. And now that we know that our pattern was significant and that, as we'll see, represents easterly waves, it's important to think that if we're examining humidity and temperature and their influence to these waves, it's good to have a sense of what's happening with the mean state of these fields. So here you have the mean humidity, specific humidity. It's the layer average from 850 hectopascals to 500 hectopascals for the Pacific and for Africa. And first of all, let's focus on humidity. So what you can initially see is that while for Africa, the maximum in humidity seems to be fairly well zonally distributed along the 10 north. For the Pacific, it's not this zonally distributed. We can see that as we are close to the continental area, we have maximums extending from South America all the way up to Central America. And then it becomes more zonally distributed. And we'll see how that kind of translates, or how that's related to the regressions we'll see later. When you look at the temperature climatology, or seasonal mean, you can see that, again, as related to one another, because as we know, or we can see the span of the temperature values, it's not like there's a great difference in temperatures. But with relation to one another, over the Pacific, we don't see as much variation in temperature, either zonally or meridionally, with the exception of this area. But when we look at Africa, we can see that there's more of a zonal and meridional gradient in temperature. And this is important, as we'll see later. So we can already start forming an idea. When we look at the linear regression maps, here we have the precipitation is the shaded fields. The geopotential height at 700 hectopascals, which is a level in our atmosphere that has very strong easterly wave signature or signal. And the vectors are the zonal winds. So the pattern, as you can see, over both regions resembles easterly wave-like patterns, as has been done in previous studies. And we have these regions of alternating high and low pressure, where the dashed contours are low pressure, and the solid contours are high pressure, that are co-located with regions of enhanced precipitation and suppressed precipitation. So we kind of see already this nice pattern. I think that a cool thing about it is to note, and I don't think we can see this as clearly as I would like, but there's two maximum here in precipitation, one that is kind of arriving from the Caribbean and one that is kind of located close to the Panama Bight. And I think that it's also cool that we can kind of see these two influences that I was explaining at the beginning, which needs further examination, but I think it's cool to have in mind as well. So we go ahead and look at the estimated precipitation from the equation that I explained before. And I think that it's very interesting that it closely resembles the pattern from the EOF precipitation above. And again, we remember that this was just purely calculated with humidity and temperature values. So this is really interesting. And of course, you could argue the estimated precipitation was calculated or derived with EOF precipitation. So of course, it would capture that pattern. I'll show later that it does a good job with other data sets. But I think that it's kind of nice that you have that pattern being consistent. Now we look at the humidity structure, horizontal structure. And I think that it's kind of nice. As you see, you have enhanced values for humidity being co-located with enhanced values for precipitation, and as well for the negative values, negative anomaly values of humidity being co-located with suppressed convection or suppressed precipitation. I will say that the humidity values here are column averages, as I showed with the climatologies or the seasonal means, and that they are in units of energy, so the specific humidity values were multiplied by the latent heat of vaporization. And this was done so that we could compare it to the temperature anomalies, which were multiplied by CP. And what you can see here when we look now at the temperature horizontal structure, and you compare Africa with the Pacific, again, they share the same scale. Over Africa, the signal is very weak in temperature, while for Africa, the signal is fairly strong in comparison to the Pacific. Whereas when you compare both signatures here and humidity, they're comparable. And this can already start giving you ideas on the relative contributions from these terms for both of the waves, right? For Pacific easterly waves and African easterly waves. So, as I mentioned before, how well does it really work, or the estimated precipitation represent other data sets? So here, same picture as above, right? EOF precipitation and the estimated precipitation with EOF data. So what we did to kind of address this question was that we also looked at trim precipitation. And so here, the data actually spans the period of 1998 to 2015. But when we had trim, it actually does a decent job at capturing the precipitation pattern, right? You can see that the regions of enhanced precipitation are well co-located, and suppressed precipitation also. And this is consistent over both of the regions, which is very nice. So yeah, it does capture the pattern. Now that we have seen this horizontal structure and kind of have this visual perspective, how do we quantify how they're related? So we went ahead and carried out some correlations. So this is estimated precipitation on the y-axis and EOF precipitation on the x-axis. And we'll see that for both Pacific easterly waves and African easterly waves, we have a high correlation of 0.92 and 0.94. And you could say, well, yeah, but that only gives me information of how they're correlated spatially, right? Does it really give me a good estimate of this precipitation? So we went ahead and drew the one-to-one relationship, and what the slope tells us is that it is actually capturing these values fairly well. There's this one-to-one relationship over both of the regions, which is really nice. So now we go back to the equations, and we remember that you can get the separate contributions from temperature and humidity, and you can kind of examine how they are contributing to the year of high precipitation, the total precipitation. So when you look at the temperature contribution in this top row, and you compare it with the humidity contribution in the bottom row, and again, the left side is for Pacific easterly waves, right-hand side for African easterly waves, you can see that for the Pacific, when you compare, while the correlation is strong for both, you can see that the slopes are not as comparable. It's a lot larger for humidity over the Pacific. When you look at Africa, the slopes are, it's still still larger for humidity, but it's more comparable in its values. And both correlations are very high. So we can already kind of start thinking about, well, you know, over Africa, it seems that the contribution from both humidity and temperature is more balanced, while for the Pacific, humidity seems to be taking more of a lead in terms of how much it's contributing to the full precipitation. And for this, it's necessary to carry out further analysis, and this goes back to Angel's talk in the CBEP seminar a couple of months back, and even Victor's talk on Monday. And so we look at N mode. So for N mode, this is a non-dimensional quantity that was developed by Adames et al. In 2019. It gives us very useful information. So it was derived through scale analysis. And essentially, a value of N mode can help you determine where within the spectrum of convectively coupled waves a certain phenomenon falls. Okay, so a value of N mode that is a lot less than 1 would be closer to the moisture mode group. A value of N mode that is a lot larger than 1 would fall under gravity wave group. And a value close to unity would mean that the wave is influenced by moisture and gravity wave. It's a mixed wave, so it's influenced by both processes. Again, this framework of N mode was further developed by Adames in 2022, a recent paper. And here is how it was determined. So the CP here represents the gravity wave phase speed. So in this case, the phase speed of our easterly waves. C would be the phase speed of our easterly waves. C would be gravity wave phase speed, and alpha would be the Shakira parameter. And again, value that is a lot less than 1 would be close to moisture mode. Waves were mostly modulated by moisture, and a value a lot larger than 1 would be gravity waves. Waves who are predominantly modulated by buoyancy or temperature. So we went ahead and did a lag regression analysis. And for the determination of our phase speeds, we used the objective calculation using a random transform. This was also done in MITE et al. 2021, if anybody's interested. But what we can automatically see is that easterly waves over the Pacific show a slower propagation than easterly waves over Africa. So we can already kind of start imagining what will happen with our calculation of N mode. And as we would expect, easterly waves over Africa have values that are a lot closer to moisture modes, while easterly waves over Africa have values that are closer to unity, indicating that this would be these waves would have more moisture mode behavior, whereas this would be closer to a mixed wave. But taking this a little further from what Victor actually showed on Monday, we have these papers that you have Adames et al. In 2022, which introduced N mode, and Ahmed et al. In 2021, which kind of gave us these moisture mode criteria, but based more on theory and prognostic equations. So MITE et al. Further developed this idea for more diagnostic criteria that could be applicable to observations as well. So we're taking the MITE et al. Criteria from 2022, and essentially it's these three. Our first criteria kind of tells us that moisture mode anomalies must exhibit a high coherence with precipitation anomalies in order to be considered a moisture mode. The mode was also obeyed with temperature gradient balance, as we explained in previous slides, where the vertical advection of dry static energy must be due or caused by the diabatic heating. And finally, that thermodynamic variations in the mode must be dominated by moisture. In this case, moistatic energy must be dominated by latent heat of vaporization times the specific humidity. And we go ahead and look at these three criteria over the Pacific. What we can see with the first criteria, our correlation is fairly strong, right? So we can say that Pacific usually waves, go ahead and check that criteria. When we look at the criteria for the weak temperature gradient, we can see that while the correlation is very high, we expected to see a higher value for the slope, and we're kind of still exploring this criteria. This is fairly new results from maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, but they're still strong values or high values, and it's undoubtedly the third criteria is met where the moistatic energy is dominated by moisture. Yeah.
Just wanted to comment on the middle one. So that's all reanalysis data, right?
Yeah. It's a reanalysis
so there's going to be
data.
an analysis increment that's going to play a role as well, where the reanalysis gets adjusted to observations.
Yeah. And we also actually kind of looked at the residual for both of the regions, and we saw that the residual was also large.
Okay.
So we kind of have our ideas, but yeah, it's something that we're still kind of exploring. Yeah.
Yeah, we do think that it's probably the analysis increment that's
Mhm.
coming
Yeah.
here and kind of throwing a wrench into the results.
Yeah, it's pretty, I found that the analysis increments definitely make a difference to the dry static energy budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really important about that, like the fact that why we're so interested in kind of understanding what's happening here is because, as Victor mentioned before, this is kind of like one of the most important criteria if you want to determine if a wave is a moisture mode indeed or not.
Right, but
yeah,
it also shows that the model isn't doing very well.
yeah.
If the analysis increment is big, then the model
Yeah.
isn't doing very well, so that motivates your work, right?
Yeah. When we compare the same criteria over Africa, we can see that while it's sort of a positive correlation, it does not pass the first criteria, as the previous results would suggest. When we look at the weak temperature gradient criteria, however, it does do a really good job here. And as I said before, this is kind of a trickier situation that we're still exploring, but yeah, these results were fairly interesting. And when you look at the moistatic energy and the moisture contribution to moistatic energy, we see that it also kind of does a good job, but the slope, again, is not exactly 1, it's a little larger. So what we can see is that for Pacific easterly waves, the criteria are closer to a moisture mode. We're still examining these, but the African easterly waves kind of deviate a little bit from this. So this brings us to our resolution, our initial questions. Does water vapor play a role in the organization of easterly waves, or the convection in easterly waves? Yes. Does temperature play a role in the organization of convection in easterly waves? Also yes. And this is true for both domains, because even if the contribution is a little less, it does play a role over both of the regions. But the relative role is different. And this brings us to our third question. Are the easterly waves over Africa different to easterly waves over the Eastern Pacific? And if so, how different are they from one another? Which brings us to our takeaway points. So our results show that the plume-buoyancy, or the estimated precipitation that we've seen, accurately diagnoses Pacific and African easterly wave precipitation. We also observed that while fluctuations in humidity seem to dominate Pacific easterly waves, humidity and temperature seem to contribute equally or have a more balanced contribution to African easterly waves. Through the examination of end-mode values, it would indicate that Pacific easterly waves are moisture modes, while African easterly waves are mixed waves. And through the examination of the moisture mode criteria, it seems to indicate that Pacific easterly waves show higher moisture mode behavior than African easterly waves, but as I said before, that weak temperature gradient criteria needs further examination. And that leaves me with questions, so I'll be happy to take any.
is a question that seems interesting to me would be to follow the evolution of an individual Pacific easterly wave and then an African easterly wave into it, developing into maybe a tropical disturbance. What are the characteristic end mode changes and various other relationship changes that occur when you do that?
Yeah, we actually have talked a little bit about this, I think, with Victor, and we were really interested in seeing how specific waves develop. We have talked about a lot of ways of doing this. For example, Núñez and Ocasio, I forget the exact year, but they put out a study that is it's really nice about easterly waves that are developers versus non-developers.
Oh, yeah.
So it would be kind of interesting to see, for example, over Africa, how different, in terms of end mode, these two types of waves that are developers and non-developers are, to see how moisture could be contributing to potential cyclogenesis, for example. And over the Pacific, we kind of said that it would be nice to explore, or to kind of separate easterly waves traveling from Africa or originating in situ, and kind of examining it this way as well. But yeah, it's definitely a question that we've talked about a lot, but we don't have a clear answer to yet.
Thanks.
No problem. Yeah.
I have a question, hopefully it makes sense, but, so I'm curious, how would you expect, perhaps from a model perspective, like if, as the climate is changing and we're knowing that surface temperatures are rising and moisture might be also changing in the atmosphere, how might this impact the ways in which these waves are formed and also organized in convection? So from a model perspective, would that mean kind of the background temperature and moisture states would be changing themselves, and that would need to be implemented into the models? Or, and I'm just curious then if this kind of feeds into the whole convective aggregation theory as well.
That's actually a really cool, interesting question as well. That's actually kind of the topic of my finance proposal for this year, where we kind of propose to examine how these structures, thermodynamic structures that we've observed for both waves, might change under global warming through the study of I'm used to the terminology now, but of global circulation models and such. I don't have a clear answer. I keep saying, I think that we talked about this a little bit during our tropical meteorology class as well, and sort of like a maybe naive hypothesis at most would be maybe with the atmosphere being able to hold more moisture might play a little bit more of a role, but that's a very naive hypothesis, or but yeah, it's something that we're still
Yeah. So I would guess that your little convective parameterization would change, right?
Yeah, that's
between P and Q and T, but how that would change.
It's still.
I guess you'd have to look at a thermodynamic diagram, a moistatic energy diagram. About that.
Which we hope to get funding for and determine and see how it looks. Go ahead.
I know that I asked you a question last night, but I do have more.
It's okay.
Maybe they're a naive question because I'm
It's
not
okay.
a tropic person yet. So my first question would be, what could be maybe the factors that can contribute to have more the Pacific wave and more moisture driven rather than the African easterly wave. So what are other factors that can contribute to this difference in the moisture content? It could be topography, one of them, or
so there's a lot of, to make sure, aside from moisture and temperature, what can modulate?
Yes.
Yeah, so actually there's a very interesting paper by Rydbeck et al. 2017. It's kind of building, I think, from the paper in 2015, from Rydbeck and Maloney in 2015. But they kind of examined to kind of determine this questions about the origin in situ or waves traveling from Africa. What they did was that with models, I believe, they kind of changed the topography, where they kind of lowered the topography a lot. And what they saw that was for the Pacific, for example, the wave activity diminished a lot. So yeah, it does play a big role, and it's essentially because, for example, In those cases, reducing the topography over South America and the Central America, a lot of the topography does influence a lot of the development of mesoscale convective systems, for example. However, a cool thing that they saw in that paper as well was that, like, by removing the topography, essentially, waves still occurred. So they were like, well, it must be also, like, you should be getting influences from other disturbances, for example, or other forcings such as waves traveling from Africa. But yeah, other how do you say that? Other things might come into play. Yeah.
My second question would be, I know that you didn't did that, but I'm just wondering, what would you think the vertical profile will look like in different areas? Like, you will see that the moisture contains mostly in the lower troposphere in the Pacific, rather than
We actually did look at that. I just didn't show it. But I have the vertical profiles somewhere along here. And again, this is for anomalies, so this is the regressions at each level, and kind of seeing that vertical cross section of both of the terms. So here, this is for the principal component 1 and 2 over the Pacific, and this is for the principal component 1 and 2 over Africa. I believe that I don't believe, I know. The shading is temperature. Sorry, that one is confusing. But the shading is for temperature anomalies or regressions, and the solid contours and shaded contours are for negative and positive values of specific humidity. So this is kind of like the structure that we observed. We further applied like a EOF analysis on the vertical levels, and we saw that for the Pacific, the vertical structure kind of follows the Firstberg clinic. For Africa, that wasn't as clear. It was definitely not a Firstberg clinic, but it wasn't like also a very clean structure where you could say, well, it's a second or third Berg clinic. But yeah, this is essentially, they are different vertical structures. Yeah.
So I just want to comment further on your discrepancy in the Wtg relationship there. So my hypothesis would be that what's happening is basically the model is trying to adjust things to a different temperature stratification than what observations are saying, and that's consistently the case.
Okay.
And so basically what's happening is, like, maybe the model is trying to adjust things to too warm in the upper troposphere, and so it adds a bunch of latent heating to try and make that adjustment. The analysis comes along, says, no, hey, it's colder here, pulls it back to a colder temperature, and then that repeats.
Okay.
And that's why you're ending up with the analysis increment playing a significant role.
Okay.
So I would argue that the del.SV is actually a better estimate of what's happening in your state than the diabatic heating. And I think that's consistent with the way other people have thought about this. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
In this diagram, how come the tropopause region is so much more active in the Pacific than it seems to be in the Atlantic, in terms of having a signal?
Yeah, I'm actually not 100% sure about that. Yeah, I haven't given it too much
Well, maybe it doesn't mean anything, I just know it. But it's interesting, it's conspicuous.
Yeah.
I was curious, in what sense, this is going back to like your first slide, I guess, but in what sense are these waves as opposed to, particularly the African easterly, the so-called African easterly waves, are they waves as opposed to discrete mesoscale convective clusters? Because when you look at as an example, when you look at the potential vorticity associated with these waves, they're manifest as discrete blobs as opposed to wave-like structures along the PD grade.
I haven't actually looked at PD yet, so I wouldn't be able to give a very complete answer. But yeah, I could look further into that, give a better answer. Yeah. Oh, sorry, reader.
Yeah, I had a question. Do you think that like oscillations like ENSO might affect how dependent the Pacific easterly waves are on the moisture? Like you see some patterns that during El Nino there were more dependence on moisture, and during La Nina there was less. Have you seen seen anything like that? I'm just curious.
I actually haven't read much literature about it, but I wouldn't be surprised. But it's not something that I know much about. I don't know if Victor him might have. Yeah, I'm sorry for but it might. I just haven't read much about it. Yeah.
My question was, so your precipitation parameterization from Ahmed and
Yeah.
Neal in 2018 had boundary layer moistatic energy in it too, right? Did you fold that into the temperature somehow, or what did you do with that?
So
It's got three terms the way you presented
Yeah.
it.
So what I looked at specifically, I'm gonna go back to it. It's close. Okay. How I went about it, I just looked at the contribution by the lower free troposphere humidity and temperature. Because when we look at the enthalpy, it wasn't contributing at it as much.
Okay.
Like it was basically like we did the same correlations and everything, like we did everything for it, but it was really not a high correlation. It wasn't contributing as much to the whole precipitation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I know that we talked one day and you mentioned that the African easterly wave, they divide into the ones from the northern and ones from the southern part, and they have different contributions to the development of tropical cyclones.
Yeah.
So my question would be, could you classify or divide those African easterly wave into this group? One, they are going to be compared or very similar to the Pacific one just by dividing them in them, or?
So yeah, again, giving a shout out to Nunez Ocasio et al. They did that. They actually show really interesting figures where they also look at, I believe it was like equivalent potential temperature and such, or they also looked at moisture, for example, contributions and how do I explain this? I might not be giving a good explanation, but from the figures itself, you kind of see that the humidity could be playing more of a role in, for example, the non-developers versus the developers.
No, but I'm
yeah.
not referring to the developers or non-developers. I'm referring to.
Oh, you're saying like that some are more northerly tracked or southerly tracked.
Exactly.
You can also see, I think you can also see that in their paper in association to the cyclogenesis.
So by dividing these two into different applications,
Yeah.
where one of them can compare with the Pacific one.
Well, I don't know if they can compare yet because I haven't done the study, but that's why I mean, like it would be really interesting to look at these two. Like if somebody has already separated them, look at both of them as individual systems and kind of apply the same study and see how, if their thermodynamics also vary. And if like maybe the developers are more modulated by moisture, whereas the non-developers might be more mixed. But I haven't done that yet. It's just like more of a speculation or a research interest at this point. Yeah.
I think that there's some studies that show that the southerly trapped ones are the ones that tend to be more associated with genesis because they tend to be more aligned with the monsoon trough, which means that they usually have a larger moisture signature, have a lot more convection, so it's easier for everything to like wrap itself together into a TC. Whereas the northern ones are more shallow. They're kind of more associated with like desert convection. And they can develop too, but not as often as the southern ones.
Yeah.
Is what I think.
So it might be a good idea to Michael or John mentioned to analyze and individual cases just to see how exactly they look like.
Yeah, that's actually a suggestion we got at AMS. Ian?
I don't know if you mentioned this, but I'm almost certain you're using precipitation anomalies, correct?
Yeah.
Between African and Pacific easterly waves, which one produces more rainfall total? Not a lot. Anomaly, sorry.
Yeah, so I can go into, okay, so here they kind of produce similar precipitation anomalies, and that goes, like for example, like I guess this would be a better picture. image, sorry. But they're kind of comparable. I would say that this is more spread out in maybe the anomaly values. But I could check that out too. I think it would be nice to maybe do like a more quantitative study on that too.
Are those like anomalies from like global average or domain average?
They're domain average,
Okay.
yeah. And, oh, sorry, yeah.
Great, so another question I had was, at what point in the life cycle of these waves did you do the analysis? And did you, if you were you tracking the wave at different times and they all contribute to this analysis? Or did you take it so many days after it moved off the African coast as an example? Or were you following the waves over Africa as part of this analysis as well?
Yeah, so essentially how I got this, I just did the UF analysis over the whole period. So I'm just getting the predominant pattern for that portion of time I filtered it for. So it gives me like the predominant variability on that like 2 to 6 day period. So it would not give me, like, it's not like I started tracking it at a certain time, but it gives me like it's not like a composite, but the average picture, the most important picture of what's happening during that period, during all that time period, I would say, yeah. I think that, Terry, you had something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
No,
yeah,
you-
so I was curious about, you mentioned that you had some trim in the analysis.
Yeah, I did.
And so did you have a plot where you compared the precipitation like rate to the precipitation rate of the model?
Oh, like doing something like this,
Yeah.
but with trim? I haven't, but
And,
I should.
and I guess my question is like, I know that for the lower rainfall rates, it doesn't do quite as well
Okay.
as for the higher rainfall. And I was just curious that, like, I remember you showed that you had those 3 different components
Yeah.
that kind of went into the precipitation. It was like the temperature and moisture.
Mhm.
And I was just curious, like, what your correlation would look like as a function of rain rate if you did it for those two versus the observations, you know?
Mm. Yeah, I can definitely go ahead and do that.
I was just curious.
Yeah, for trim, unfortunately, the only figure that I have developed is this one, but it would kind of be cool to do that same comparison with trim as well.
Yeah, and I know that
yeah.
they also have GPM, and then
Mhm.
CloudSat does really well with the drizzle, or does better with the lower rate precipitation. Yeah.
So there's a new paper by Brandon Woulding and co-authors that just got accepted that essentially just looks at what are essentially, like, you can break, what Rosa is doing is a linear analysis, but they did the nonlinear case, which is what you're looking for, which can actually break it down into different rainfall rates. And they essentially call the moisture contribution the dilution component, and the temperature is kind of like a cape-like, sin-like component. And they do all sorts of bases and stuff. So I can tell you what the reference is if you're curious in that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, just curious.
They look at different types of precipitation mostly.
Yeah, they look at
They're
different
looking at
types,
clouds. Yeah. This, I don't think the drizzle really matters for this, right? Because this is the bulk precipitation.
Have you looked at African easterly waves relative to the Saharan area? Because that seems to change their character quite a bit.
Yeah, I haven't looked at them. That would be really cool to look at as well. Yeah.
And there's one more thing, that African easterly waves change in character from the early part of the season to the point where the Cape Verde season starts and then where it ends. So during that window between about typically July 15th and October 15th, the waves are very different than they are during other seasons, presumably generated similar waves. That might be interesting too, to
Yeah.
see how they vary.
Yeah, yeah, I should look into that as well. Yeah, that's actually really interesting as well. I think that someone during my AMS talk mentioned something along the same lines as well. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will look into that. Yep.
Do you expect these, you kind of hinted at it, but do you expect these differences to play a role in how often these waves, like the end mode in particular, develop into hurricanes?
Yeah, so like,
And which direction would the correlation go? The temperature ones are more likely to develop into hurricanes, or the...
yeah. So now I might be because I don't remember this exactly, but I think that by looking at Nunez-Ocasio, I think that they might have hinted at that the developers were more southerly tracked, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. And the southerly tracks seem to have more influences from moisture. So it could be that the ones that are maybe more modulated by moisture in terms of like end mode could be the ones that do go on to more frequently develop into TCs, but it's just like speculation. I'm not actually 100% sure, but it would be something really cool to look at as well.
But isn't it possible, to your point earlier on, Hel, that those southerly disturbances are closer to the monsoonal trough? So they're in a vorticity-rich environment compared to the northern ones. So it might be possible that it's just the original vorticity value that gives them an edge in developing, right? Is that right?
That's actually something that Kayleen and I are looking for her thesis. So, so we'll have the answer maybe in either next couple of months or a year. Who knows how research goes?
Okay.
But we are looking into that.
Excellent.
Yeah, she is looking into developers and non-developers.
That's my research. I'm basically continuing Rosa's research
Yeah.
with in the Africa region and with developers and non-developers.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm following Angel and Victor. Feeling is following mine.
Yes.
Train.
Yeah, wave train.
All right, I think we have enough questions. Thank you all for your interest. And,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.